Hello, hello. Okay, so today you are going to need four things actually. You're going to want a calculator, maybe. That's kind of person to person. You are also going to want both your Chapter 3 and your Chapter 2 postulate sheets. Now, a reminder, the reason we put the information on the postulate sheets, the reason you want these filled out is because in future chapters you get to use the postulate sheets on all the tests. But in future chapters, you will not get to use any notes packet other than the most current notes packet. So make sure you're getting these filled out. Filled in versions of these are on Schoology. So if you need to get one filled out, then make sure that you're using your work time today to get those filled out. Otherwise, ours should be fully filled out as of what we have done so far in class. Notes packet, you're going to be opened up to page 10, and that is where we are going to begin. So grab the calculator, grab those postulate sheets, grab your notes packet. This is all that we're going to be going through. It says, find the measure of angle 1 and the measure of angle 2. Justify with the theorems and definitions used for each angle. So in order to do this, the first thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to notice that I have parallel lines going on, and that means that I can use these four postulates and theorems. If I don't have parallel lines, then I've only got things like linear pairs and vertical angles to work with, or adjacent angles. So I want to find the measure of each angle. I choose one to start with. I'm going to start with, well, angle 1. So I'm going to look at what kind of angle pairing these two are. This is my transversal. They are on the opposite side of it, and they're both between these, but they're not sharing a vertex. That means they are alternate interior angles. And according to this, alternate interior angles are congruent, which means the measure of angle 1 is the same as this angle, which is 110 degrees. And I'm always going to refer back to the one angle I know. But that's only half the answer. Actually, that's less than half the answer, because I also want to find the measure of angle 2, but I also want to say why I was able to know this. Well, we had alternate interior angles, so we used the alternate interior angle theorem. But that's not the only theorem we actually used. Or at least, that's not the only definition we used. We used the alternate interior angle theorem to say they were congruent. But we also used the definition of congruent to know that being congruent meant that they were equal. Every single one of these is going to use at least two different things. So you're going to have to look for that. Most of the time, it's going to be definition of congruent as the secondary item, but not always. So I will tell you about when it's different. Okay, next one I'm looking at is solving for the measure of angle 2. Now I ignore angle 1 while I'm doing this. I could use angle 1 to help me, but I always try to refer back to the original angle that I knew. And there's a reason for that, and it's gonna just kind of help us as we do things tomorrow, but I don't have to. So, if I were to pair up these two, again, I have the parallel lines. They're on the same side of the transversal. One's interior, one's exterior, but they're not sharing a vertex. That is corresponding angles. And corresponding angles are also congruent, which means the measure of angle 2 is also 110 degrees. Now, don't get ahead of yourself and just assume that they're all the same measure. They're not. A lot of them will be. And that was corresponding angles, so we used a corresponding angle postulate. And since it said they were congruent in the postulate, we did also have to use definition of congruent. If it said something other than congruent, then that's when we're not using definition of congruent. Okay, question 2. Again, I'm going to refer back to the angle I know whenever possible. So, got a 63-degree angle here. It is on the same side of transversal as angle 1. One's interior, one's exterior, and yes, I have those parallels. I need that. But since it's on the same side, one interior, one exterior, not sharing a vertex, that's corresponding angles again. And corresponding angles are still congruent, and therefore it is 63 degrees. Using that corresponding angles postulate and the definition of congruent. Now, for the measure of angle 2, they're on the same side of the transversal still, but they're both interior, which means they're consecutive interior angles, and consecutive interior angles are supplementary. So, now in all technicality, that means the measure of angle, using this definition of supplementary, that means measure of angle 2 plus the 63-degree angle is going to be equal to 180, but many of you would just probably say, hey, they add up to 180, so I subtract the 63 from 180. And you're getting the same thing. Measure of angle 2 is equal to 117 degrees. And that was because they were consecutive interior angles. So we used the consecutive interior angle, and that's a theorem. And that theorem told us they were supplementary. How did we know what supplementary meant? The definition of supplementary. We did not use definition of congruence here. Definition of congruent only comes out when we're told things are congruent. Definition of supplementary comes out when we're told things are supplementary. Moving on. First, looking for the measure of angle 1. I noticed that I do have parallel lines here, but I also noticed that angle 1 and the 95-degree angle share a vertex, which means they're one of these two style of angles, either vertical or a linear pair. Since I see that they are across from one another on the x, they are vertical angles, and vertical angles are congruent. The measure of angle 1 is equal to 95 degrees, and that's the vertical angle theorem. Now the theorem says they are congruent, which means we also used the definition of congruent. Moving on to angle 2. The 95-degree angle and angle 2 are on the same side of the transversal. One's interior, one's exterior. They don't share a vertex. That's corresponding. Corresponding angles, according to my postulate sheet, are congruent. So it's a 95-degree angle. Using that corresponding angles postulate and definition of congruence. Okay, one final problem here. And this one is actually going to be one of the more challenging ones. First off, there are 3 parallel lines, which means as I'm looking at some of these, I need to ignore one of the lines. So I'm going to be covering things up. So if I want to solve for the measure of angle 1, 121 degrees is this angle. Angle 1 is this angle. This line did not get used, so I'm going to ignore that line. Now, you could just straight up ignore it. I'm going to cover it for the sake of appearances, but you don't want to like scribble it out because we're going to need that line later. Okay, these two. They are on the same side of the transversal because this is my transversal. They are both exterior. There's no angle pairing for that. So unfortunately, I need to find a workabout. Now, if only these two angles were on opposite sides of the transversal and both exterior, that would be so much easier to work with. For example, like angle 1 and this angle right here. Then we could work with this. And why am I talking about this? Because that's how we're going to make this work for us. We can find this angle here. And if we find this angle here, then we have alternate exterior angles. How do we find this angle here? Well, this angle and this angle share a vertex, and they create this straight line together. That is a linear pair. And according to the linear pair postulate, that means they are supplementary. So I'm going to just call this x. And, well, I know that those two are going to add up to 180. I'm going to get rid of my sticky note for now. And I know that then x plus 121 equals 180. Now, many of you would probably have just done 180 minus 121, and I'm okay with that. But I'm doing this for the sake of those who aren't necessarily seeing this. For those who struggle to figure out what to do next. Subtract that, and I get that x is a 59-degree angle. So now that I know that this is 59 degrees, now I can use the fact that these were alternate exterior angles and therefore are congruent. So that means that the measure of angle 1 is equal to 59 degrees. But what postulates and theorems did I use to get there? First off, I used linear pair, which means I used the linear pair postulate. And that linear pair postulate told me that things were supplementary. Therefore, I had to use the definition of supplementary. Once I had that, then I had exterior angles. Therefore, I used the alternate exterior angle theorem. And that theorem said things were congruent, so I used the definition of congruent. If you have to go through and find an angle in order to find the angle you want, you're going to use more theorems than just two. Sometimes you might use the same one twice, but it's just going to be a little more complicated. And I could have also gone different ways about getting this angle. I could have chosen to find this angle right here, and then those two would have been corresponding. I would have used linear pair and corresponding angles. This would have looked a little different, but it's only this angle pair that would have ended up changing. The AEA would have changed. But essentially, it can happen. Okay, final problem. Looking for measure of angle 2. Measure of angle 2. So, these two now, this angle and this angle, are not using this middle line. So I'm going to ignore that middle line. They're on opposite sides of the transversal, both exterior, because this middle line is telling me nothing. So I ignore it. And they're outside of these two lines being cut. So they're alternate exterior angles, and therefore they are congruent. Measure of angle 2 is equal to the 121 degrees. They were alternate exterior angles. We used the alternate exterior angle theorem, which said they were congruent. And since it said they were congruent, we used the definition of congruent. Okay. So, today, we went through the beginning of section 3.4. We got a couple days left on it. Today is the 15th. Our homework is due on Tuesday. Do not wait to do it until Tuesday. Tuesday is the 22nd, and it's 3.4 worksheet. Reminder, 3.2 worksheet is due today. Be amazing for the sub. Next thing you're going to be doing is transitioning over to your guys' quiz. So you can have your notes packet out, you can have your postulate sheets out, but your homework assignments should go away.